The 15th of July 1943, Solomon Sea, 0400 hours. A faint haze drifted low over the black surface of the water, lit only by the muted glow of a quarter moon sinking behind a bank of clouds. The convoy pushed eastward in a staggered formation, dark silhouettes of cargo hulls blending into the night. Their engines beat a steady, monotonous pulse, a rhythm that traveled across the water like a deep mechanical heartbeat. Above them, the Allied radar picket ship USS Tallahatchie held position, its skeletal lattice mast carrying the long, curved antenna that swept the horizon with relentless precision. The crew inside the dim radar shack worked quietly, their faces illuminated in pale green light. The air was thick with humidity, heavy enough to cling to uniforms and fog the metal edges of console screens. The radar watch officer, Lieutenant Samuel Pritchard, kept one hand on his headset, listening to the low static drifting between operator reports. He had learned to distinguish patterns in the interference, whether clutter, temperature inversions, sharp returns off small islands, but tonight the screen was unusually sparse. No contacts, no hints of approaching threat. Only the soft circular sweep of the trace and the faint hum of the set. Below deck, Marines leaned tiredly against bulkheads, half asleep from long days escorting supply ships. They were carrying ammunition, spare aircraft parts, and medical kits bound for New Georgia. On the horizon to the west, the faint outline of distant storm clouds pulsed with slow flashes of heat lightning. The ocean was calm, deceptive in its stillness. Pritchard stepped back from the radar console and wiped condensation from the metal rim. The warmth of the shack mixed with the metallic scent of the machinery, and the faint thrum of the ship's generators resonated through the deck plating beneath his boots. He turned to the junior operator seated to his right. "Nothing yet?" Pritchard asked quietly. "Just sea return and weather," the operator replied, adjusting a dial. "Range seems stable." But something in the air unsettled Pritchard, an intuition shaped by weeks of watching Japanese strike patterns evolve. The Zero fighters had begun appearing from unexpected vectors, slipping past detection nets that were supposed to provide early warning. Pilots described them as ghosts emerging from the clouds, perfectly timed attacks that fell upon convoys with brutal precision. Up on deck, a cool wind moved across the bow, carrying with it the smell of salt and oil. Crewmen scanned the darkness with binoculars, though they knew visibility was hopeless before dawn. The convoy behind Tallahatchie spread out in a long trail, their running lights masked, their wake shimmering faintly under the moon's fading light. Every few minutes the ship's engines shifted pitch as the helmsman made minor course corrections. At 0420, the radar shack static deepened. A surge of atmospheric noise washed across the headset channels, followed by a subtle tremor in the sweep. The junior operator frowned, tapping the glass with one finger. A faint spike had appeared, then faded, too quick to classify. Pritchard leaned over his shoulder. "Check gain," he instructed. "I'm on it." The operator adjusted the controls, slowly increasing sensitivity. The sweep returned to normal, smooth and unbroken. The spike didn't come back. Pritchard exhaled slowly, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Temperature layers in this region could bend signals in strange ways. The Japanese had also begun flying lower than expected, dangerously low, skimming the water to avoid radar beams. Combined with cloud cover and early morning haze, they could slip past the outer screen entirely. Distant thunder rolled from the west. The silhouettes of the ships behind Tallahatchie became faint smudges against the horizon as the darkness deepened before dawn. A few sailors stood near the rail, gripping mugs of coffee, listening to the water break softly along the hull. Conversations were minimal. Every man understood the vulnerability of pre-dawn hours. The radar operator stiffened. "Sir, interference again. Same quadrant." He pointed to the faint flicker near the outer edge of the display. Pritchard leaned in. The signal was barely there, a tiny distortion on the sweep, as if something had momentarily reflected energy back to the set. Not strong enough to mark as a target, but too distinct to ignore. "Hold that sector," he said. The operator kept his eyes fixed on the screen. The distortion appeared again, then vanished. Once more, farther left. Then nothing. Pritchard's pulse tightened. "Log it," he ordered. "Notify CIC." The Combat Information Center sent word to the convoy, possible distant movement, unknown. Nothing conclusive, just a snarl of interference. The merchants tightened formation, engines rumbling harder as they closed distance. A faint, Uneasy tension settled across Tallahatchie. Sailors adjusted straps on their helmets. Officers stepped out onto the deck, scanning the sky, though nothing broke the horizon. The moon had vanished behind clouds, plunging the sea into deeper darkness. The radar set went quiet, too quiet. Static thinned to a faint hiss. The entire screen cleared, as though the air itself had been wiped clean. The operator tested the circuits, tapped the display, adjusted connections. Everything responded. Everything functioned. But the sky remained empty. 0530 approached, the first hints of dawn forming a grey seam along the eastern horizon. The convoy churned forward, engines echoing across the water. The radar shack remained tense, operators rigid at their stations. Pritchard stepped outside to clear his mind. Wind moved across the deck, ruffling the flags, carrying the faint hum of distant engines. For a moment he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he'd heard something. An engine? A whistle of air? Nothing repeated. He returned to the radar shack, jaw tense. A final distortion flickered across the screen, shallow, brief, almost insignificant. Within minutes, the horizon behind the convoy would begin turning red with the rising sun. The men aboard USS Tallahatchie remained unaware that the Zeros were already overhead, too low, too fast, too silent for the radar to reveal. And the convoy continued onward, engine steady, unaware of the shadows gathering above the clouds behind them. The first thin line of dawn spread along the horizon, casting a muted grey wash over the Solomon Sea. The convoy's hulls emerged from the darkness as silhouettes shaped by morning haze, their decks glistening with moisture collected overnight. The sky carried a faint peach tint, but the sun had not yet risen high enough to burn through the low clouds drifting in layered streaks. Every sound carried farther in the cool morning air, the rhythmic slap of waves against steel, the distant hum of engines, the metallic clatter of loose gear shifting on deck. Inside the radar shack of USS Tallahatchie, Lieutenant Pritchard hovered over the consoles, listening intently to the static-filtered chatter from the convoy's other picket ships. All reported clear screens. No aircraft sighted. No confirmed radar contacts. But each report was delivered with the same tight, cautious tone. Something was wrong, though none of them could yet identify it. The last flicker on the radar an hour earlier still sat in Pritchard's mind like a splinter. His operators were confident the set was working normally, and the diagnostics showed no failure. The sweep remained steady, reliable, mathematical. Yet the air outside felt charged, an intangible tension that drifted through every compartment of the ship. A bosun's mate opened the shack door to deliver a message, and warm, humid air spilled inside, carrying the briny scent of the sea. The message was simple: maintain readiness. Keep bearings. Eyes up. Pritchard folded the paper and kept his gaze on the blank screen. Below deck, the Marine detachment prepared for another long day of escort duty. Some sipped coffee, others adjusted gear, others simply sat quietly, listening to the vibration of the engines. They had endured weeks of air attacks, bombers, dive bombers, torpedo runs, but the Zeros remained the most unpredictable threat. Their speed, maneuverability, and willingness to skim perilously low over the water made them difficult to prepare for. On the horizon, a thin band of cloud stretched along the western sky, its edges glowing faintly. The water beneath it shimmered with dawn light. A lookout on the forward deck scanned the sector, noting only the faintest movement of seabirds circling above distant reefs. The morning seemed calm, deceptively so. At 0607, a soft clank echoed through the radar shack as the sweep line passed directly over a shallow return. The operator sat upright. "Sir." "Contact." His voice was hesitant. Pritchard stepped closer. The return was faint, barely more than a tremor, but it appeared at an unusual altitude. Something low. Something fast. But before he could mark the range, it vanished. He checked the bearing again. Another blip emerged moments later, farther out. Weak, then gone. The pattern felt deliberate. Temperature inversions along the sea lanes often caused radar shadows, but these weren't shadows. These felt like silhouettes passing through blind spots, slivers of movement carved perfectly along the edges of the radar's lowest detection band. The realization tightened something in Pritchard's chest. He leaned toward the operator. Increase sensitivity on the lower sweep band. Focus on the 5 to 12 mile range. The operator's fingers moved quickly across the dusty metal controls, adjusting dials, balancing signal interference. The screen flickered, stabilizing a moment later. Nothing appeared. Outside, the sea breeze shifted, carrying the thin, rising scent of distant rain. The storm clouds to the west were moving closer, darkening the sky. Sailors on deck raised collars against the wind, tightening straps on their gear. The convoy behind Tallahatchie altered formation slightly, maintaining spacing as choppy waves began forming under the push of incoming weather. At 0619, one of the destroyers trailing the column radioed in with a whispered transmission. Possible sound contact overhead, cannot confirm, no visual. The words crackled through static, barely audible. Pritchard immediately forwarded it to the captain and keyed the CIC. Tallahatchie requesting confirmation on that last transmission. Clarify nature of sound contact. The reply came seconds later. Negative, Tallahatchie. Lookout believes it may have been wind shear. No aircraft sighted. Pritchard exhaled slowly, though doubt consumed him. Something about the report matched the unnatural hush earlier, the faint sense of movement passing just beyond human perception. On the convoy decks, tension accumulated like condensation on metal. Crewmen stood at their stations, scanning the sky with binoculars, though morning haze made the upper air appear smeared and colorless. Far to the southwest, destroyers cut through the water with sharper wakes, engines groaning under increased revolutions. Officers quietly reviewed anti-aircraft readiness, ensuring gunners were awake, positioned, and tracking sectors. A lookout on the Tallahatchie shouted down to the bridge, movement at extreme altitude, faint contrails bending through the haze. The bridge crew confirmed through binoculars, several thin streaks far above, direction unknown. The altitude was too high for immediate threat, but their presence was unsettling. Reconnaissance. A feint. Or an escort for something farther below. Pritchard stepped out briefly onto the deck, scanning the sky. The faint contrails seemed to drift, barely visible in the morning light. Japanese high-altitude scouts sometimes preceded major attacks, but the timing didn't match typical patterns. The air was too calm, the formation too scattered. He returned to the shack, suddenly aware of how quiet the radar had become. Almost unnaturally quiet. Another flicker. This one appeared closer. The operator's hand froze on the range dial. The return crawled across the very bottom of the display, so low that if it had been 100 feet lower, the radar would not have registered it at all. Pritchard leaned in, breath held. Altitude, nearly sea level. Range, 5 miles. Direction, fast. Then it disappeared completely, as though it had melted into the waves. Pritchard's voice tightened. Send contact suspicion to all escorts. Emphasize low-altitude unknowns. At the same moment the message went out, a strange phenomenon occurred outside. Lookouts on multiple ships reported a faint distortion of morning light near the horizon, like the shimmer of heat rising from desert sand. But there was no heat, only the cool morning air and the incoming clouds. On one of the cargo ships, a marine gunner wiped condensation from his goggles and stared into the haze. For an instant he thought he saw shapes, dark specks sliding along the waterline. But when he blinked, they were gone, replaced by rolling mist. In the radar shack, the screen cleared once more, leaving behind only the gentle, steady pulse of the sweep. The first real hint of danger revealed itself not through radar, not through radio, but through sound, a faint, rising buzz, like a swarm of distant insects approaching through the haze. The Zero fighters were coming in low. Very low. Riding the line between sea and sky, in the dead space radar could not touch. By the time most of the convoy realized something was wrong, the shadows were already cutting through the morning mist, their engines masked beneath the hum of the ships. And the Allied crews braced themselves, unaware of how many would break through, and how fast the world around them was about to change. The rising buzz grew into a sharp, unmistakable snarl, high-pitched, aggressive, and closing fast. It cut through the morning air like a blade, thin but piercing, and every man on the forward decks of the convoy felt it before they fully understood it. A Marine corporal on the lead transport dropped his coffee mug, listening as the sound swelled from a faint tremor to a rushing roar. The first Zero broke through the haze at 0646. It appeared almost as a phantom at first, just a thin silhouette emerging from the morning mist, skimming barely 20 feet above the surface of the water. The sun, still low behind the clouds, cast a pale line of light along its fuselage. Its engine whined at a pitch that felt unnatural at such low altitude, the propeller blades beating rapid shockwaves across the waves. Then another appeared behind it. Then 4 more. Within seconds, the convoy's entire western flank erupted with shouts, whistles, and the chaotic scramble of boots pounding across steel decks. Gunners shouted bearings, officers yelled for readiness, and sailors rushed toward stations with hands trembling from the sudden transition from calm to crisis. Aboard USS Tallahatchie, Lieutenant Pritchard froze for half a heartbeat at the sound, a sound their radar had never revealed. The Zero formation had slipped entirely beneath the detection layer, emerging directly in the kill zone of the convoy. The first attack came almost instantly. A Zero streaked along the starboard side of the second cargo ship, guns flashing in thin, staccato bursts. Tracers tore across the deck, shattering crates and punching through metal sheeting. A sailor dove behind a ventilator cowling as the rounds punched into the decking inches from where he'd been standing moments before. Anti-aircraft guns began barking in response. The convoy's destroyers fired first, 20mm cannons hammering upward, their casings clattering onto the deck as gunners tracked the low silhouettes racing past. But the Zeros were too fast. They darted through the defensive arcs like razor-edged birds, banking sharply, weaving between masts, using the very structure of the convoy as cover. On the port side, a Zero dipped a wing and slid between 2 cargo ships, its engine screaming as it passed close enough for men on both vessels to see the pilot's goggles. A machine gun burst ripped across the deck of the rearmost ship, sending sparks across metal plating and knocking a Marine off his feet. He rolled toward the rail, barely catching a rope as debris rained around him. Inside the radar shack, the screens flickered uselessly. The sweeping beam displayed empty space, unable to show the chaos unfolding directly around them. Pritchard keyed his headset. CIC, this is radar. Enemy aircraft confirmed, low altitude, multiple hostiles inside the formation. Radar unable to track. The reply was drowned out by the roar overhead as 2 Zeros shot past the Tallahatchie's bridge, their wings cutting thin ribbons in the air. Gunners on the forward mounts opened fire immediately, tracers stitching a line through the sky, but the fighters banked sharply and vanished into the haze again. The sea surface churned with prop wash as the Zeros looped around for another pass. Their tactics were methodical: hit from low altitude, scatter the convoy, isolate ships, then strike the ones least able to defend themselves. At 0651 a Zero pulled up hard, rising out of the mist like a phantom, and opened fire on the lead cargo transport. A stream of rounds tore into the forward deck, igniting a haze of smoke. Men scrambled behind winches and crates, shouting for extinguishers. The ship's .50 calibers finally returned fire, sending short, fierce bursts into the air. One tracer clipped the Zero's tail but didn't alter its course. On the Tallahatchie, the bridge shook as a line of machine gun fire stitched across the superstructure, punching through a signal locker and showering the deck with fragments of metal and paper. An ensign dove behind a bulkhead as a fresh burst ripped through the wheelhouse windows, scattering glass like ice across the floor. Destroyers on the outer perimeter adjusted course, engines thundering as they rushed to intercept the incoming fighters. Their 5-inch guns barked thunderous reports, the shells screaming into the air with sharp, echoing cracks. The explosions blossomed above the water, throwing pillars of spray skyward, but the Zeros were already dipping beneath the blasts before the fuses activated. The convoy began tightening formation to consolidate its defensive fire, but the maneuver unintentionally created choke points. The Zeros exploited them with deadly precision. One fighter screamed between 2 ships with its wings nearly brushing the rigging. Anti-aircraft guns struggled to track it without hitting friendly vessels. The pilot twisted the aircraft sideways, slipping through the narrow gap before leveling out and firing a burst into the aft deck of the rearmost freighter. A fireball erupted as fuel drums ignited. Black smoke billowed upward in thick columns as crewmen rushed to contain the flames. The Zero banked away, disappearing into the fog before any of the ships could return fire. On Tallahatchie, Pritchard staggered as the ship shuddered violently. A near miss from a strafing run clipped the starboard rail, shredding a section of the deck. The radar shack vibrated as another burst struck the aft superstructure. Pritchard grabbed the nearest railing, forcing himself to maintain clarity. "Report conditions across convoy," he ordered. Static crackled, punctuated by frantic transmissions. "Taking fire, port side hit, requesting suppression. Zero diving, bearing 180. Fires on deck, containment underway. Cannot track, request visual only." The radar team exchanged helpless glances. Their equipment was useless in a battle playing out entirely below its detection threshold. Outside, 3 Zeros formed into a shallow V and swept along the convoy's centerline. Their synchronized machine gun bursts carved shimmering arcs of tracer light across the decks. Men ducked behind armored shields as rounds hammered steel plating and ricocheted into the sea. A gun crew aboard the destroyer Geraghty finally caught a Zero in a turning climb. Their 40mm boffers pumped shell after shell into the sky, the rhythm steady and deadly. The Zero tried to roll out of the arc but misjudged its altitude. A stream of shells tore into the fuselage. Flames burst from its side, trailing smoke as the fighter spiraled downward. It struck the water with a violent splash, sending a plume 30 feet high. But even as the gunners cheered, more Zeros emerged from the haze, dozens, moving with terrifying coordination. The convoy had survived the first wave. But the second wave was already descending. And this one was aimed directly at the weakest ships in the formation. The second wave came with a deeper, more resonant engine tone, disciplined, coordinated, and intent. The haze had lifted slightly by 0702, revealing long streaks of sunlight filtering through the cloud shelf. The sea carried a dull, metallic sheen as the Zero fighters swept down in two broad attack lines, their wings glinting in the morning light. They flew lower than the first wave, hugging the surface so tightly that their wakes left brief ripples across the water. The convoy was already wounded. Columns of black smoke rose from two transports struck in the initial pass, and the forward decks of others were littered with splintered wood, torn steel, and scattered debris. Gunners were sweating through their shirts, faces streaked with soot and salt, eyes burning from smoke drifting across the decks. The air vibrated with the constant cacophony of gunfire, engine whines, ricochets, and shouted commands echoing across the sea. Aboard USS Tallahatchie, Lieutenant Pritchard braced himself against the bulkhead as the next swarm of fighters passed overhead. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries roared back to life, 20mm guns hammering the sky, 40mm mounts thundering in rhythmic bursts. Tracer lines arched upward in crisscross patterns, briefly illuminating the underside of the Zeros as they weaved and banked with surgical precision. The second wave seemed to understand exactly where the weakest links were. A cargo vessel near the rear of the column was isolated, drifting slightly off course from earlier structural damage. Fires flickered along its forward deck, and most of its gunners were occupied trying to contain the flames. The Zeros saw the vulnerability instantly. 3 fighters peeled away, diving toward it in a near-vertical drop. Their engines shrieked as they released coordinated streams of machine gun fire. The rounds stitched across the deck, slicing through the starboard gun platform and knocking 2 crewmen to the floor. The ship's aft .50 caliber opened fire in desperation, its tracers arching wildly through the mist. 1 Zero banked hard to avoid the fire, skimming so close to the water that its wingtip left a thin wake. Another pulled up sharply, rising through a storm of tracers before disappearing behind a curtain of smoke. The third Zero struck home. A burst of rounds tore into the cargo hold where ammunition was stored. A split second later, a violent explosion ripped through the hull, sending a towering plume of fire and smoke skyward. Fragments of metal rained across the water. The ship's bow sagged, flames spreading rapidly as the vessel began to list. Men jumped over the rails into the sea, their shouts drowned by the roar of the inferno. A destroyer cut across the convoy's formation, rushing to intercept survivors and provide covering fire. Its guns roared in every direction, 5-inch shells detonating in bright flashes overhead, 40mm mounts hammering consistently. The destroyer's wake churned the water into a frothing trail as officers shouted for increased speed and stabilized bearings. On the Tallahatchie, Pritchard kept his headset pressed tight, listening to the disjointed reports flooding in. "We've lost steering, taking water. Zero strafing run, port side, casualties reported. Fires under control but spreading, request assistance. Hostiles regrouping, coming in from the northeast." Every transmission painted a clearer picture. The Zeros had executed the perfect low-altitude penetration, using terrain, weather, and timing to bypass Allied radar entirely. The picket ships were blind, and the convoy had walked directly into an ambush they had no time to anticipate. By 0715, the second wave began to thin as fuel limits approached. The Zeros broke away in small groups, forming tight arcs before heading back toward the western sky. A final lone fighter attempted a strafing run on Tallahatchie, but its angle was too shallow. The ship's starboard 20mm guns caught it broadside. A burst of fire tore through the wing root, and the aircraft sheared downward into the water with a muffled crash. And just like that, the sky grew quiet. The smoke drifted across the convoy in dark ribbons. The sea was littered with debris, fragments of hull plating, singed wood, spent cartridges, torn life jackets, and oil swirling in iridescent patterns. Survivors from the destroyed cargo ship clung to rafts or floated in the water as rescue boats moved quickly to retrieve them. A dull throb of engines settled into the background as the ship slowed to assess damage. By 0730, the convoy reorganized into a tighter defensive formation. The destroyers took primary escort positions, and the least damaged ships positioned themselves along the outer ring to shield the transport still operational. Medical teams rushed across decks, carrying wounded men to makeshift stations. Fire crews worked to extinguish the last pockets of flame clinging to steel surfaces. Pritchard stepped onto the deck for the first time since the attack began. He surveyed the horizon, listening to the faint crackle of residual radio static mixing with the murmur of engine noise. His radar equipment had played no role, not because of malfunction, but because the tactical reality had outgrown its limitations. Japanese pilots had perfected the art of low-altitude infiltration, understanding Allied detection patterns with unnerving precision. He knew what the after-action reports would say. The Zeros had used sea-skimming tactics to exploit radar-blind zones. Weather conditions had concealed their approach. The convoy's early morning timing had aided the attack. And the picket ship screens, while competent, lacked the low-range detection capability that would later become standard. The strategic consequences were clear. Higher command would analyze the engagement and push for improved radar sets with downward scan capability, refined detection protocols, and additional airborne early warning assets. Convoy doctrine would shift, emphasizing layered defense and better low-altitude tracking. Patrol aircraft would be assigned closer to shipping lanes at dawn, when light and temperature offered perfect cover for infiltration. This attack would not be forgotten. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, shafts of warm gold pierced the haze, illuminating the damaged convoy. Smoke lifted slowly into the sky, carried by a strengthening sea breeze. The sea calmed under the spreading daylight, though the surface still rippled with the marks of the morning's violence. Men stood silently at the rails, looking at the empty horizon where the Zeros had disappeared. The battle had lasted less than 40 minutes. But its lessons would echo through every Allied operations room in the Pacific. And as USS Tallahatchie resumed its role at the head of the formation, Lieutenant Pritchard turned back toward the radar shack, knowing that the next engagement would demand more from every system, every operator, and every doctrine than ever before. The convoy pressed forward into the brightening morning, carrying with it the weight of loss and the quiet resolve that often followed battles fought at the edge of knowledge, at the edge of technology, and at the mercy of an enemy who had learned to move unseen.